by way of avenging her favorite and herself at once. For the above was an episode in the struggle that was constantly maintained between Bonaparte's and Beauharnais. Hortense presented Mademoiselle Guilbeau to her mother, who retorted on Caroline by appointing the young lady her reader. This was shortly before the journey to Bayonne. After the installation of the court at Mirac, Mademoiselle Guilbeau, whom court etiquette excluded from the drawing rooms during the day and who only entered them occasionally in the evening to entertain the company with her music, passed most of her time in what was called her room, a mere garret in reality, for the Chateau de Mirac was a small building by no means adapted to the bestowal of a court. Mademoiselle Guilbeau was vain and coquettish. She had ambitious dreams. She was bored to death at Mirac. Needless to say that she was by no means recalcitrant when a servant. The Mameluke, in fact, came to announce a visit from the emperor. Things were going on very much to her satisfaction when Lavalette, who in his capacity as postmaster general kept an eye on the correspondence of the imperial household, sent Napoleon a letter addressed to the young lady by her mother. The document gave her careful instructions as to the part she was to play, recommending her above all to secure such evidence as might best enable her to retain her hold on the emperor, and either to confirm her position or to retire with advantage therefrom. The baseness of this intrigue, in which Napoleon afterwards declared he had detected the influence of the Prince de Benevento, Talleyrand, so disgusted the emperor that the young woman was invited to step at once into a post-chaise, which conveyed her back to Paris under the charge of a servant. Monsieur de Broglie saw her as she passed through Les Ormes, where he was visiting his father-in-law, Monsieur d'Argesson. After her return to Paris, Mademoiselle Guilbeau married a certain Monsieur Sordo, who was given a receivership at the Emperor's instance. He acquitted himself ill in his office, squandering the funds entrusted to him. The Restoration came very opportunely to extricate him from his difficulties. Madame Sordo procured a presentation to the Duc de Berry, who pronounced her charming, in her eyes the most beautiful in the world, and marked his appreciation of her beauty by getting her husband appointed French consul at Tangiers. Enough has been said to show of what slight importance were these transient caprices in Napoleon's career. They made little impression on his senses, none at all on his heart. They give no insight into his affections, and are mainly interesting from the sidelights they throw upon his habits and upon such characteristics as his hatred of intrigue and his generosity. Other adventures of a like nature might be cited, the history of which has no further interest. They all deal with such facile garrison conquests as might have fallen to the share of any captain in his army. He met with these, or rather they were thrown in his way, at Berlin, Madrid, and Vienna, like the marshals and soldiers who served under him. He had the weakness common to humanity, but he was in no sense the slave to his senses. At Vienna he was struck by the appearance of a young girl who professed an enthusiastic worship for him. By his orders, a message was sent to her, summoning her to an interview at Schönbrunn. She obeyed and was brought into his presence. She could only speak German and Italian. The conversation was opened in Italian. Napoleon soon discovered that she was a daughter of respectable parents, and that her passionate admiration for himself was of the most innocent and ingenuous description. He gave orders that she should be at once conducted to her home, undertook to find her a suitable husband, and gave her a dowry of 20,000 florins. Such an instance of respectful chivalry was by no means unique in Napoleon's career. It was thrice repeated, the last time at St. Helena. Chapter 10. Josephine's coronation. Josephine's life had become a round of perpetual anxiety and ceaseless agitation within very narrow limits. It was a life at once without occupation and without repose, spent in spying upon her husband, watching all comers and goers, and questioning servants and attendants, pursued varied only by 5 toilettes a day, visits from lady friends, and the purchase of useless and costly trifles from every dealer who approached her. This existence, which resembled nothing so much as that of some sultana grown old in the indolent luxury of the harem, lacked the elements of stability. She felt that There was but one thing which could assure her future, vindicate her position, and protect her against all mischances, namely, the birth of a child. During the first Italian campaign, she had, as we know, feigned to be pregnant, but this was merely a pretext to defer her departure from Paris. Seeing how readily Napoleon swallowed the bait, Josephine, though far from grasping the full significance of the situation, felt a vague consciousness in her butterfly brain of her husband's passionate desire for posterity. On more than one occasion, she played upon this desire for her own ends, using it to gratify her taste for journeys and prolonged absences which would scarcely have been permitted in the ordinary course of things. Among such pilgrimages was the journey to Plombières, when Bonaparte sailed for Egypt. But as the first consul's power increased, she felt more and more strongly that in her case maternity was not so much as a convenient pretext as an urgent necessity. That throne, the steps of which he was steadily ascending, would be but insecure without an heir. Bonaparte, consul and head of a democratic republic, or Bonaparte, the restorer of the Bourbons, content with a life tenure of some brilliant office under the reinstated monarch, might dispense with a son, but the contingent splendors of one who should play the part of monk to the exiled dynasty had little attraction for him. Neither could he emulate the disinterested simplicity of a Washington, of force invisible and intrinsic, one of those popular currents that no power can stem. Those great tides of public opinion that carry all before them was sweeping away the obstacles in his path and bearing him on first to the consulate of the year 8, still a Republican institution, then to the consulate of the year 10, a purely autocratic organization separated from the monarchy only by a name and by the thorny question of heredity. Around this question, the solution of which rested with her, Josephine saw that all the ambitions of the one faction, all the anxieties of the other now centered. She saw that each of Bonaparte's brothers aspired to the succession, that his sisters were not without hopes as to the possible claims of their respective husbands, that every general and senator who had risen to greatness in the Revolution dreamt of possibilities still more splendid, and that the nation itself, after the convulsions through which it had passed, longed for a stability that should rest on some less temporary basis than the life of one man, and should ensure its security for a prolonged and indefinite lapse of time. If a monarchy were re-established, to whom should the reversion be assigned? To the consul's brothers? If so, on what grounds? Hereditary monarchy in its Christianized form, as derived from Hebraic institutions, implies divine sanction, but this sanction applied only to the founder of the dynasty and to his descendants in a direct line, and was never extended to collaterals. To create a claim for Bonaparte's brothers to the succession, it would have been necessary to have recourse to a fiction familiar in ancient law, and assume that the late Charles Bonaparte had been emperor of the French. But who would have accepted such a fiction? An alternative suggested itself, that of abandoning the Hebraic institution or a divine right in favor of the Roman law of adoption. The consul, choosing him he deemed worthiest to succeed him, either from among or beyond the members of his own family. But such a resolution would have been the signal for endless competition and intrigue, and who would the nation would have understood it? Could it have cast aside its prejudices touching the predestination of race, the divine vocation of a dynasty, the only solution both in law and fact, at once simple and unimpeachable, the only one which would crush ambition on the one hand and satisfy legitimate aspirations on the other, was the birth of an heir to Napoleon. But this longed-for child was not forthcoming. Whose was the fault? His or Josephine's? On this point, Josephine felt that her position was vulnerable. She racked her brain for remedies. One after the other, she visited all the mineral springs reputed to be of special virtue in such cases. Forges, Plombières, and Luxeuil. She assiduously followed the treatment indicated by Corvisart. She consulted quacks. She visited charlatans. She made pilgrimages. At Plombières, she betook herself to the Capuchin's cave, where Frere Jean, its guardian, vainly promised her the fulfillment of her wishes. Deluded by false hopes, she repeatedly inspired Napoleon with joyful anticipations, which he could not refrain from communicating to his intimates. When these proved illusory, his vexation would master him and find vent in cutting sarcasms. One day, when he had arranged to hunt in the forest at Malmaison, Madame Bonaparte came to him in tears. "How can you think of such a thing? All our animals are with young." "We must give it up, then," was the retort. "It seems that everything here is prolific, except Madame." In public, he persistently cast the blame upon her, but in his secret thoughts, doubts had arisen, which Josephine took care to foster. Perhaps the fault lay with himself. He remembered Madame Fouris, among others. Josephine had borne her first husband children. On every possible occasion, she brought them forward to prove that the common misfortune was not to be laid on her account. Her incessant harping on this theme exasperated Madame Bacciocchi, who silenced her at last by the caustic remark, "But my dear sister, you were a good deal younger in those days." Nevertheless, she contrived to imbue the whole family more or less with this idea. Napoleon himself tacitly accepted the imputation. Often he would say to his brother Joseph, "I have no children, and you all say I shall never have any. Josephine is not likely to have any more at her age, though she has all the will in the world to prove the contrary. Therefore, I say, after me the deluge." When, after his return from Spain, Lucien suggested a divorce and a marriage with one of the Infantas, a variety of motives led the consul to reject his propositions, but it is not improbable that the chief among them was his distrust of himself. Marriage with a Bourbon would be a decisive step towards the throne, but would such a stake be worth playing for if children were denied him? Nevertheless, the idea had been mooted, and by Lucien, for whom Josephine had little love already, and who had suggested the divorce on Bonaparte's return from Egypt. Napoleon was fond of declaring that his wife was incapable of resentment as a pigeon, but this was only true of her when her position was not attacked. From this time forth, she did her best to estrange the brothers. She enlisted her friends in the cause and did not scruple to repeat doubtful slanders and to insist on damaging facts. She felt no regret when the rupture was finally brought about. It was an enemy the less. The doubts with which she had succeeded in inspiring Napoleon in 1801 had served her by banishing the idea of a divorce for a time, but chance might dissipate these doubts, and Josephine felt herself completely at the mercy of such a hazard. There was certainly little danger to be feared from the actresses he had hitherto met. Had any one of them given birth to a child, Bonaparte had hardly a sufficient stock of simplicity to claim a paternity so many might have disputed with him. Neither was there much ground for uneasiness in his intrigues with the married ladies of the consular court. Here again it would be difficult or impossible to affirm the paternity of the child, difficult even to have any conviction on the subject, unless on the evidence of some striking physical resemblance, which so far had not proclaimed itself, but it needed only some such adventure as liaison with Madame Fouris to convince Napoleon of the possibility of becoming the father of an heir to the throne, and this consummation once arrived at, Josephine felt that the downfall of her fortunes would be imminent, for Bonaparte now claimed equality with any ancient dynasty in Europe, much more than might he consider himself the peer of the noblest families among the old French aristocracy. And there was no lack of intermediaries such as Talleyrand, the accursed cripple, ready to tempt him with suggestions of names and promises of help.